Last week, we talked about gender, sexuality, and the emergence of the civil rights movement. Specifically, we discussed Black women's anti-rape activism and the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to 1956. So, a few of the main ideas I tried to convey in that lecture were: number one, that women were leaders of the movement. Two, there was a more specific argument that Black women's anti-rape activism in the 1940s and 1950s built a movement that organized the successful Montgomery bus boycott. And three, the movement was fundamentally grassroots. So I want you to keep a couple of these main points in mind for today. The most important ones are that number one and number three, that women were leaders of the movement and that the movement was fundamentally grassroots. So I can't cover everything in this, the whole history of the civil rights movement. So I'm going to deal with the main political and strategic developments of the movement from the late 1950s to the late 1960s with the rise of Black power. So the three main points that I want to make are: number one, religious leadership and youth played a big role in pushing the movement forward. So that's number one, religious leadership and youth played a big role in pushing the movement forward. Two, the movement was up against tremendous opposition, which became nonviolent. Which became quite violent, The movement was up against tremendous opposition, which became very violent. So, number three, the civil rights movement was perhaps the most successful social movement in U.S. history, breaking down Jim Crow segregation, which had been in place since the failures of Reconstruction in the 1870s, and making significant progress towards racial inequality. However, it's important to recognize that the downfall of Jim Crow did not do away with racial inequality in its entirety. So the goals, the movement coalesced around three main goals. Number one, breaking down segregation in public space, schools, restaurants, and transportation in particular. So breaking down segregation of public space, number one. Number two, challenging the disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South. So restrictions on voting in communities like Selma, Alabama, where the majority of the population was Black, but less than 1% of Black people were registered to vote by 1965. So number one, segregation of public space. Two, voting. Three, by the late 1960s, after various Supreme Court decisions and laws against segregation, the movement started to address poverty and inequality in the Black community. So from the late 50s through the mid-60s, the time period at the heart of the movement, there are four main organizations to remember. The four main organizations are the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, which was founded in 1909 with the help of people like W.E.B. Du Bois. Two, the Congress of Racial Equality, founded in Chicago in 1942, which would set up a shop in the South as well as the North. And three, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, founded in January of 1957 after the end of the Montgomery bus boycott, as you know. Martin Luther King Jr. would be the main leader of SCLC. And fourth, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, formed in 1960 with the help of Ella Baker, a leader of the civil rights movement. So the latter two organizations are going to be the most important organizations to remember: the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Those are the two I'll focus on today. So both SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and SNCC, as it was known, which is short for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, advocated nonviolent direct action as the core strategy of the movement until the 1960s. So SCLC viewed nonviolence philosophically. In other words, the organization promoted a moral as well as a strategic opposition to the use of violence in the movement. SNCC, on the other hand, viewed the use of nonviolence strategically by and large. SNCC viewed nonviolent tactics as the most effective tactics that would help make gains in the movement. So the win victories during the movement. So that's one key difference. Another major difference is that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, centered around a number of charismatic, mostly male preachers as the leaders of the movement. So Martin Luther King Jr. was the most prominent leader, of course. In fact, Martin Luther King Jr. basically had veto power within SCLC. He also had a very huge following. The leadership of SCLC would move from city to city to work on one main campaign at a time. So that's how they organized in the South. They would move from one city to another and work on one main campaign at a time. And they very strategically incorporated the word Christian into the organization's name. This is in the context of the global Cold War, right? So to distinguish itself from the atheistic communist world and to deflect charges of communism, this organization included the word Christian in its name. So SCLC was also quite concerned with portraying itself as respectable. SCLC and SNCC worked closely together, but had some key differences in their political approaches that became stronger in the mid-1960s. So in contrast to SCLC, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was led by young people, often people who were college students, but also high school students. For the first half of the 60s, SNCC tended to rotate leadership. So rather than there being one charismatic leader, the SNCC rotated leadership in its organization. The biggest, most fundamental difference is that SNCC, under Ella Baker's influence, focused on building leadership in the communities where it organized. So for the first half of the 1960s, it largely rejected centering its work around one charismatic leadership. SNCC promoted what it called group-centered leadership. They said we need lots of leaders, not just one charismatic leader. We need to build leadership among the people wherever we go for this movement to be successful. So that's a key difference between SCLC and SNCC, is that SNCC was more bottom-up. They promoted what they called group-centered leadership. SCLC was more top-down and was centered around certain charismatic leaders. And because SNCC was more bottom-up, women became leaders in SNCC in a way that never happened in SCLC. So it's people like, I already mentioned Ella Baker, but also Diane Nash was quite important in SNCC. She's pictured here on this slide. And we'll talk more about her in a second. So now I want to talk a little bit about the arc of the movement. So the movement's biggest successes came from defying white authority in the South, right? By engaging in civil disobedience, by breaking the law to make a political point and to make demands. So as you know, the Montgomery bus boycott, so it lasted over a year. It ended in December of 1956. In her book about Ella Baker, historian Barbara Ransby said that the evolution of the movement, quote, the flurry of activities in the late 1950s was about to feed into the frenetic pace of the 1960s. So I think that's a good way to describe it, right? So though the Montgomery bus boycott can and should be considered the first major event of the civil rights movement, the pace of the movement really picked up starting in 1960. So you can see from this timeline, right, that in the 1960s, that's when most of the events of the civil rights movement happened, when most of the campaigns and protests happened. So there's not enough time to go over everything, the whole arc of the civil rights movement. So I'll highlight briefly a few of the major campaigns and events which are highlighted in blue. We've already talked about the Montgomery bus boycott. So I'll talk about the lunch counter sit-ins to protest segregation, which really kicked off this frenetic pace of the 1960s. I'll briefly mention the Birmingham Campaign and the March on Washington in 1963. Then in 1964, I'll focus on Freedom Summer and the Civil Rights Act in particular. And then I'll talk about the birth of the Black Power movement, the founding of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, and I'll also talk about the Memphis Sanitation Workers strike, which is the strike by low-wage workers when Martin Luther King Jr., that's where he's assassinated. He goes to Memphis to support mainly black workforce of sanitation workers. So on February 1st, 1960, 4 black college students, pictured here, sat at a lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, that was reserved for white people, and they refused to leave. The students had been trained in nonviolence and refused to fight back when they were harassed. So this is the first event, like I said, that marked the beginning of the frenetic pace of the 1960s. This action in Greensboro sparked a series of similar sit-ins throughout the South, including in Nashville, Tennessee. In Nashville, student activists, including Diane Nash and Angela Butler, led activists in their first lunch counter sit-in. The students took their seats in a peaceful and orderly manner. The sit-ins continued in the same way for 2 weeks, almost without incident. But soon, a group of white people gathered, angered by the stance that the students were taking, and as white people attacked the students who were sitting in, the police stood by and did nothing. So I'll show you a video clip of what this sit-in Nashville, Tennessee looked like.
Leave and should go off the NAACP meeting.
The sit-ins continued without incident for almost 2 weeks. Then, on February 27th, a warning. Gangs of toughs were gathering downtown. The students sat in as planned. The police did nothing to protect them. The students remained true to their training in nonviolence. When the police vans arrived, more than 80 demonstrators were arrested and charged with disorderly conduct.
The day that the police first arrested us, they announced to us, "Okay, all you niggers, get up from the lunch counter and, or we're going to arrest you." And their attitude was like, "Well, we warned you." So they repeated it a couple of times and nobody moved. And of course we were prepared for this. So they said, "Well, we warned you. You won't move. Okay, everybody's under arrest." And then they turned and they looked around at the lunch counter again. And the second wave of students had all taken seats. And they were confounded. Kind of looked at each other like, "Now what do we do, And they said, "Well, okay, we'll arrest those too." And they did it in the third wave. And no matter what they did and how many they arrested, there was still a lunch counter full of students there.
Peace, quiet, and good order will be maintained in our city to the best of our ability.
So that was a video clip of Diane Nash, who was one of the major leaders of she was a college student at the time, and she was one of the major leaders of the sit-ins in Memphis, Tennessee, and a leader in SNCC as well. So to fight the jailings of their children, right? Their children, these college students who were arrested, the parents of the protesters engaged in a boycott of downtown businesses. And soon, people in the North were boycotting stores that were segregated in the South. These two tactics side by side, so it's the sit-ins, right, with the students filling up the jails and members of the community boycotting the stores, produced results. After just a couple of weeks in Nashville, the lunch counters became desegregated. And these sit-ins, they spread to nearly 70 cities across the South. They're important so these sit-ins are important for a couple of reasons. One, they are nonviolent, right? The tactic of the sit-in was more bold and confrontational than the tactic of the Montgomery bus boycott. So the sit-ins, they signal a new direction for the civil rights movement. And two, out of the sit-ins came the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the spring of 1960. So as you saw in the video clip of white people beating up student protesters, activists in the civil rights movement faced tremendous opposition by all levels of white society, from their white neighbors and police and city governments all the way up to the federal government. There's people like Bull Connor, the police chief in Birmingham, Alabama, also George Wallace, the governor of Alabama. But the federal government, certainly more sympathetic to the civil rights movement than whites in the South, was also very slow to act. Movement activists often called on the federal government to protect them from local violence, but it often took a crisis for the government to act, for the federal government to act. So at the time, John F. Kennedy was president. He was assassinated in November of 1963, and then Lyndon Johnson was the president from 1963 to 1969. Both men, right, both presidents are relatively liberal. One would expect them to be more responsive to the civil rights movement, and they do over time, but it takes the civil rights movement to really push them, as well as the federal government more generally, to actually do something about all of the violence directed at civil rights activists. So white citizens councils were first formed in Mississippi after the Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education, desegregating the public schools, or mandating the desegregation of the public schools, though it takes a while for that to actually happen. So these white citizens councils, they soon spread throughout the South to promote resistance to segregation at all costs. They consisted of respected members of the community, politicians, business owners, bankers, etc. They did things like deny loans to black farmers, kick black sharecroppers off their land for trying to vote, foreclosed on homes, pushed for the passage of laws to ensure white domination in the South. These white citizens councils were the public face of white supremacy during the civil rights movement. So some members were also active in vigilante violence. People like Byron de la Beckwith, a member of the White Citizens Council in Mississippi, who murdered Medgar Evars, a civil rights leader with the NAACP, in June of 1963. Evars was targeted because of his long record of civil rights activism. Prior to his murder, for 10 years, he had traveled the state of Mississippi organizing for the NAACP. He supported students who were being beaten for engaging in sit-ins in Jackson, Mississippi in 1963. So 2 all-white juries refused to convict Byron de la Beckwith in the 1960s. There's a movie, Ghosts of Mississippi, about the 1994 retrial of de la Beckwith that resulted in his conviction 31 years after the murder of Medgar Evars. So I'll play the song Mississippi Goddamn at the beginning of the class on Monday so we can discuss it then. Nina Simone wrote the song and performed it in response to all of the violence against civil rights activists in Mississippi during the early 1960s. So I'm going to skip through some of this. So there's the Birmingham Campaign in 1963, one of the most famous civil rights campaigns. It was led by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It was a children's campaign, so children, and not just high school students or college students, but even younger children participated in this campaign to desegregate Birmingham, the entire city of Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham, because it was so violent, what became known as Bombingham, actually. So, and Bull Connor was that arch segregationist who was willing to use brutality against protesters. So, a lot of the most famous scenes of the civil rights movement: dogs attacking children, water hoses, being used against protesters come from this Birmingham campaign in 1963. Then, of course, there's also the March on Washington in 1963, which is a major national action with hundreds of thousands of people who gather in Washington, D.C. to put pressure on the federal government to act in defense of black civil rights in the South. Though a lot of activists say this was not the major action of the civil rights movement, this was largely symbolic. The main events of the civil rights movement, the main campaigns were the campaigns like the sit-ins, the campaign in Birmingham, other campaigns like Freedom Summer, which we're about to talk about. So the meat of the movement, the major events of the movement, are these other campaigns, not necessarily this March on Washington, which was a one-day march, right? These other campaigns, they last weeks and months. People risk violence and even death to participate in the civil rights movement. So the March on Washington is like one of the most well-known events of the civil rights movement, but it is really largely symbolic, right? It gets a decent amount of media attention. It puts pressure on the federal government, but it's not the main event of the civil rights movement. So the murder of Medgar Evars focused national attention on Mississippi because it was known as one of the most violent states in the South. It was one of the states also that was most resistant to change during the civil rights movement. Because of this, during the summer of 1964, Bob Moses, one of the main leaders of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, announced Freedom Summer. So an organization was formed called the Council of Federated Organizations, or COFO. It was basically a coalition of the four major civil rights organizations in the South that I'd already talked about. So SNCC, SCLC, the Congress on Racial Equality, and the NAACP, they all worked together to coordinate Freedom Summer in the summer of 1964. So the idea here was to convince sympathetic liberals from the North to travel south to help with voter registration in Mississippi, as well as other civil rights projects. So it's voter registration, but it's also other civil rights projects. Teachers came from the North to work in freedom schools in the South. These SNCC opened 41 freedom schools throughout the South in which teachers taught kids who had been denied an education, the basics like reading, writing, and arithmetic, but they also taught about African American history and the civil rights struggles that were taking place in that moment. People during Freedom Summer worked in community centers. They did research for the movement. They went door to door talking to people throughout Mississippi. So the idea here was to increase national attention on the movement. If white students from the North came to the South, people would pay attention if something happened. Most of the people who came south for Freedom Summer were students, most of whom were from northern universities. They were warned before coming of the violence that plagued Mississippi, right? And many of these students, and we'll talk about this more later, many of these students who got their start in the civil rights movement would go on to lead the anti-war movement as well as other social movements of the 1960s and 1970s. So I'm going to play this clip. It's a couple of minutes long about Freedom Summer. Maybe I won't play it. Doesn't seem to be playing. Never mind. Okay, I'll put this online. I'll put it on D2L when I put the video up. Okay, so during Freedom Summer, there were this, what became national, one thing in particular, right, was in on the front page of newspapers across the country. It's when two white kids from the North went missing, the federal government and the nation paid attention. So three people went missing. Two of them were white, one of them was black, but because the two young white college students from the North went missing, the nation paid attention. And And civil rights activists knew that this would happen, right? When white people were subject to violence, when they were murdered over the course of the civil rights movement, the federal government and the nation paid attention. So by the end of the summer, right, 80 civil rights workers were beaten and 1,000 were jailed. And then, so there was a search for these three young men, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, throughout the summer, and they were finally found. Their bodies were found, buried on August 4th, 1964. They had been shot to death. A later report revealed that James Cheney, the one black man who went missing, had suffered bone and skull fractures, indicating that he had been beaten before he was murdered. So the families of James Cheney and Michael Schwerner wanted them buried side by side, but because Mississippi's cemeteries were still segregated, that was impossible. So I'm going to skip through some of this. There's also one major campaign is the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party of 1964 to desegregate the Democratic Party in the South. Essentially, the Mississippi Democratic Party wanted to replace the all-white delegation sent from Mississippi to the Democratic National Convention with an interracial delegation that included black voters from the South, black members of the Democratic Party from the South. The Democratic Party largely rejected the demands of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. There was a compromise, but it was not much of a compromise that was struck. So there are two really large successes of the movement. The first success is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is passed under President Lyndon Johnson's watch. And this piece of legislation outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It also pledged the federal government to implement desegregation in broad areas of life, including the workplace, but mainly targeted buses, bowling alleys, parks, lunch counters, and so on. The Civil Rights Act didn't have strong enforcement powers at the time of its passage, but it did get stronger over time. So at first it was symbolic, but it would become more important later in years, and it did not immediately end segregation in the South. So there's also the passage of the Voting Rights Act in August of 1965, which came after Lyndon Johnson was elected president, and after the big voting rights march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, which the movie Selma is about. If you haven't seen it, it's a really good movie. So I would say that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is the single greatest achievement of the civil rights movement because it prohibits discrimination in voting. The Voting Rights Act also has enforcement mechanisms. It sends federal registrars to the South to register voters and run the elections. So it says the South has prohibited people from voting, black people from voting, so now the federal government has to step in and make sure that the black population in the South can actually vote. And this is what's needed, the federal government moving in much the same way it did during Reconstruction after the Civil War, to break down disenfranchisement. So the movement continued, though, after the mid-60s. So though the movement had many successes, but there was still much that needed to be done. Black people, for instance, were still at the bottom of the economic hierarchy. They were doing the poorest paid and most exploitative kinds of labor in the South and actually throughout the country. So Martin Luther King Jr.'s last campaign would be to support black sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968. Sanitation workers in Memphis began a strike on February 11th, 1968, due to dangerous working conditions, their really poor pay, and the discrimination that they faced on the job. So what might have once been viewed as a traditional labor strike essentially became a civil rights struggle. The strike received national attention when Martin Luther King Jr. went to Memphis to support the workers. So he would be assassinated in Memphis while supporting the strikers on April 4th, 1968. He was only 39 years old at the time. The day before, 3,000 people had gathered to hear him speak, to give his final speech on the evening of April 3rd, 1968. So let's see if this works. It's a section of his speech during which he seems to foretell his own death.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Okay, so I just want to end by talking about the emergence of Black Power and the Black Panther Party. So the rise of Black Power comes out of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's experiences in the South and their frustration of the Black population in general of the slow pace of change during the Civil Rights Movement. So this phrase, Black Power, is first uttered by Stokely Carmichael, who's pictured here on the right, the newly elected leader of SNCC in 1966 during the March Against Fear in Mississippi. Carmichael and other activists in SNCC are in turn inspired by some of the ideas promoted by Malcolm X as well. So Black Power also comes out of frustrations with racial inequality, police brutality, and poverty in Black communities in places like Oakland and Chicago and Los Angeles and New York and San Francisco, right? So outside of the South, the persistence of racial inequality and Black poverty in the South, but also outside of the South. There are also riots in cities like Los Angeles and Detroit and Newark, New Jersey and San Francisco and New York that are manifestations of Black frustration and inequality. And Black Power promotes a couple of things. So number one, it's distinguished from the Civil Rights Movement for a couple of reasons. Number one, it promotes the right to self-defense rather than the philosophy of nonviolence. In Mississippi, a lot of rural African Americans had actually carried arms, and SNCC was exposed to an active tradition of self-defense in the Black community against white violence. So, number one, the right to self-defense against white violence. Two, black pride, black nationalism, and the right of self-determination, right? The idea that black people should organize black people, and other people, including white people, should organize in their own communities for racial justice. The seeds for this come out of Freedom Summer, in the summer of 1964. Some of their frustrations working alongside white middle-class people who came from the North. The white activists were committed, helpful, and risked their lives, but their white privilege could play out in domineering ways within the movement spaces as well, within organizing spaces and within these campaigns. So I want to emphasize also that even though Black Power activists said black people should organize black people, they did not reject organizing in coalition with other people of color and with whites. They just emphasized the need for black people to organize each other. So for instance, there was a big strike at San Francisco State to establish black studies and ethnic studies. The student group, the Black Students Union, which promoted Black Power, worked side by side with students of color and white students in Students for a Democratic Society and the Third World Liberation Front. So they believed in coalitional politics. Another essential component of their politics was radicalism over liberalism. So in addition to challenging legal discrimination, advocates of Black Power often questioned capitalism. They spoke out against American imperialism and foreign policy, including the war in Vietnam. So proponents of Black Power had a broader politics than those promoted during the Civil Rights Movement, which is kind of laser focused on segregation of public spaces and voting rights for much of its history. And Black Power became a grassroots movement throughout the country in the 1960s. The discipline of Black studies and ethnic studies, for instance, came out of the Black Power movement. So it's a grassroots movement and exists throughout the country in the late 60s and into the 70s. So the Black Panther Party is perhaps the most prominent organization that came out of the Black Power movement, though it certainly was not the only one. So the Black Panther Party, which was originally called the Black Panthers for Self-Defense, was founded in Oakland, California in 1966. In the late 60s, the Black Panther Party has spread to 30 cities around the country. Stokely Carmichael left SNCC to work with the Black Panther Party, setting up chapters on the East Coast. The founders of the Black Panther Party, Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, they first met as college students at Merritt College, a community college in Oakland, where they were involved in establishing the very first department of Black Studies in the nation. So the Black Panther Party placed the issue of police brutality front and center in its political organizing. When the police, who were mainly white, would pull over a black driver, members of the Black Panther Party would show up with guns, stand there, and just observe what was going on to help in an effort to prevent police brutality. They called this patrolling the pigs. The party reached out to black youth in the cities, both men and women, right? And though the group was most famous for their style and their advocacy of armed self-defense, they had a whole program to serve the community and a politics that went beyond self-defense. You can see here, right, this is their 10-point program. I won't repeat it all, but they demanded things like decent housing. They wanted an education that taught black people about their own history. They wanted an end to police brutality. They wanted full employment. And so on, right? So they end with, we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. So they also established programs to meet the everyday needs of the community, and their four main programs that they established were the free breakfast program for school kids. They established free health clinics and what they called liberation schools, where they taught young black children about their history and about racism, in an effort to empower the Black community. They also had a petition program for community control of the police. So these 4 main programs were: number 1, the free breakfast program for school kids; number 2, free health clinics; 3, liberation schools; and 4, a petition program for community control of the police. They wanted the community to have control over the police, to increase accountability, to end police brutality in the Black community. So I'm going to end this lecture by reiterating some of the main points, right, as I often do. So the civil rights movement is in part characterized by great leadership, right? Both men and women led the movement. There were religious leaders and students who led the movement. Also, many Black women were very instrumental in leading the movement, although they don't often get much attention. But it was fundamentally a grassroots movement. It built leadership in the Black community and throughout the South, and then in the rest of the country. And despite tremendous opposition, which often turned very, very violent, white opposition to the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement was perhaps the most successful social movement in U.S. History. However, there were failures along the way as well as successes, right? Every protest movement has successes and failures. But their hard work, persistence, their smart strategic thinking, and risk-taking against huge odds ultimately led the civil rights movement to be a great success. It was because of the hard work of people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy, Rosa Parks and Joanne Robinson, Diane Nash, Ella Baker, Stokely Carmichael, and Fannie Lou Hamer. Countless people, and the countless people who lost their lives. People like Emmett Till and Medgar Evars and Andrew Goodman and James Chaney. There are also other people who died during the movement. The 4 young girls who died after white supremacists bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. Herbert Lee in 1961, who was helping to register voters. Jimmy Lee Jackson in 1965, who was beaten and shot by state troopers trying to protect his grandfather and mother from a trooper attack on the civil rights marchers. There's James Reeb, and he was killed in 1965. He was a Unitarian minister from Boston who joined the march from Selma to Montgomery. Viola Liuzzo from Detroit. She traveled from Detroit to Alabama for the Selma March. There's Malcolm X. He's shot in 1965. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, who was assassinated in April of 1968. Countless other people, right, who went to meetings, participated in civil disobedience, and marched in demonstrations, people whose names we may never know, led to the success of the movement.